Welcome to my workshop. I'm Noelle Yukas. This is the Basics of Academic Writing. This is the first of a two-part series. The next part will be next week. So without further ado, I have a little funny image to show you. Anyone? So you have this piece of spinach in your teeth all day long. How does that make you feel?
Well, you're okay until you know it's there.
Yeah, what do you feel when you know it was there? Embarrassed, right? So you wanted to make a good first impression, right? But then you realized all day long you weren't, right? I would say that the things I'm going to cover today, if you're getting them wrong, are kind of like that spinach between your teeth. It's embarrassing when you realize that you've been doing it. However, most students don't think of it that way. They think of writing as just something they have to do to get through everything. But if you have mistakes in your mechanics and punctuation, then your writing sticks out, not in a good way. So today we are just going to be covering mechanics and punctuation. The second part of this series will cover grammar and style. So let's start with mechanics. We will be covering spelling and word choice, capitalization, italics, abbreviations, and parentheses. You will notice in your guides that I cover far more categories than these, but for the sake of the hour, this is what I'm covering. If you have any other questions regarding other topics in your handout, I'd be more than happy to answer them later on after the workshop is over. Okay, without further ado, spelling. So how many of you think to run the spell check before you turn in a paper? Yeah, okay. How many of you probably ignore those little red lines in Word? No? Okay, well good. But you may be in the minority there. A lot of students just kind of ignore the fact that Microsoft Word does have a spell check. And it is a great tool, and it does have its limits. So always run your spell check, but remember that Microsoft Word is imperfect. And oftentimes it misses the most glaring problems with grammar and punctuation. So the next point I think is really important, and a lot of non-native English speakers forget about this one little detail. I know I love the thesaurus. I know you love the thesaurus. But when you pick a word that's a synonym, it does not necessarily mean it's equal to the word that you were originally looking at. So a really good trick is to select a word and then look it up in an independent dictionary. Simply looking at that word in a sentence will help you determine whether you are planning to use it in the right way. Sounds really simple, but a lot of students don't do it. And I end up correcting word choice only because in English we tend to use a word for a certain purpose, and it can't be used in another way. Fourth point is find a second set of eyes. At the Writing Center, we have many pairs of eyes to look at your papers. And whether you plan in advance and make an appointment or you drop in, we're there to look at your paper, as an outsider and look for anything you may have missed. If we're not available, you can always find a spouse or a friend or a neighbor, someone or even a classmate who's willing to look at your paper. It never hurts to have a second set of eyes. And then lastly, however ridiculous you may feel about this, you need to read your paper out loud. So if you're a non-native English speaker, you're always hearing those around you speak English. So you're used to hearing it. If your voice is the one that's reading it out loud, you may actually catch things that you wouldn't normally catch. If you're a native English speaker, the same thing goes for catching typos in your papers. If you read it out loud, you will catch that missing and, or that slight typo, the word that isn't quite right. The next part of mechanics involves commonly confused words. Making sure that you're using the right word. Now this goes beyond just looking up words that you're picking from a thesaurus. These are words the students and business people all over commonly confuse. So, come on, Hello. Okay. Affect, effect, break, break, comprise, compose, continual, continuous, disinterested, uninterested, e.g. and i.e. That's one of my favorites. Always confused. Farther and further, irregardless. Now, irregardless, you don't confuse it with anything. It's just not a standard word in English. It's and its, lay and lie, lose and loose, method and methodology. When you write your thesis, this will be important. Principle and principle, there, and there, theirs and theirs, to, and your. This is not an exhaustive list. So you have this exact same list in your book here. So I would encourage you to look online for other ones. A good one that I see all the time is form and from. You're not necessarily confusing them, but it could be a typo in your paper that you miss entirely. So without further ado, we're going into our first activity. Now, we have a limited group here, so I'm going to ask each of you to work independently, if that's okay, and I'm here to help you if you need any help. I'm going to assign each of you a pair of commonly confused words, and I'd like you to create sentences, one for each, that illustrates the meaning of that word. And when you're finished, I'd like for you to go to the whiteboard and write your sentences. So let's start with the first example here. We have principal and principal. So the school's principal, Mr. Smith, is getting retired next year. Okay. What do you guys think? Yeah? I might say is retiring next year, but that is the correct use. So the primary principle for the programming class is to help students to have some logical thinking. What do you think? Talking about like a primary value. Okay, that works. So let's look at this one, affect and effect. So the overall effect of affecting your audience is that it gives you credit. Yes, I mean, it is technically correct. If I were to see the sentence, I would probably say it's redundant a little bit because you would want to say the effect of a specific thing affecting the audience, but you are illustrating the use of noun and verb correctly. What do you think? Yes? All right, I'm going over here. So we have continuous and continual.
The task implied a continuous effort.
You said implied?
Yes.
The task implied a continuous effort from the participants. What do you guys think? Implied a continuous. So ongoing, never stopping. Okay. The continual noise interrupted the class. Well, we know about that here, right? With all the construction. It starts and it stops and it starts again. So that's correct. Great. All right. So we have the farther you go, the longer it takes to get there. Yes? Seems right. We're talking about distance. You do want to use farther for distance. The instructor used real-life experiences to further the classroom discussion. And this is the use of further as a verb. Excellent. All right. 4 for 4. This is great. The conductor challenged students to compose original pieces of music for the final performance. Now, this is correct. This is not really the form of compose that most people confuse, though, if that makes sense. So let's look at comprise. Red, green, and blue blocks comprise most basic Lego sets. Now, this is probably the reverse of how you would say it. You probably say most basic Lego sets comprise red, green, and blue blocks. When you use comprise, you want the whole to be before the comprise, and what comes after are the parts. Okay? This is correct with compose. But oftentimes students want to say something is comprised of, and you would never use comprise in the passive like that, is comprised of. You could say something is composed of. Okay? Very good. So let's go back to the slides. Capitalization. So when I'm looking at student papers, I see so many things capitalized that do not need capitalization. I am completely aware that in the military sphere, when you're writing memos and you're writing internal documents, it's a standard to capitalize. However, in academic writing, you're only supposed to capitalize proper nouns. So we have to push ourselves to follow some rules that you're probably not accustomed to following. So names of all proper nouns should be capitalized. So here are a couple examples. The internet is considered a proper noun, believe it or not. It is a place, although it's virtual. We will capitalize the internet. Also here in the United States, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, these are entities. They are formal names. We will capitalize these. However, the example here at the bottom isn't quite right. And this is one of those examples I'll see all the time. The name of someone's title without the person's name attached would not be capitalized. So the regional manager and vice president met today. I don't know who they are. Right now, these should be lowercase. If you give a formal title plus the name, you can capitalize it. The same thing would go for the President of the United States. So if you say President Obama, capitalize P in President. If you're just saying the President, you do not have to do so. So just consider that as you're writing. Here's another one. Capitalize all major words in titles and headings. Now, that means you do not capitalize certain words. Most of you will be writing in either Chicago, APA, or IEEE. By the way, IEEE defaults to Chicago in many of these formatting rules. But you don't want to capitalize prepositions, coordinating conjunctions, or articles in the middle of a title. Whatever comes after a colon in a title would be capitalized in all of those citation styles. But you can see that the first example shows of and the in the middle of this title, the beginning of the end, is lowercase. Down here, when I'm talking about the Bill of Rights, capitalizing the and of, it's unnecessary. So keep that in mind. Only the most important words of titles are capitalized, and always the first word of the title is capitalized, despite it being either an article or a preposition or whatnot. So here's another one, and it's really hard to confuse because we often talk about the East or the West as in hemispheres or ideology, all ideologies rather. So if you're talking about the East or the West, the North or the South the same way, as in an area, a region, you can capitalize it. So this first example is good. Students from the West often melt in Eastern humidity. So the West, that would be the western half of the United States. It's a region. But if you're talking about an area in like a smaller region, for instance, western Oklahoma, you wouldn't capitalize western. Just keep that in mind. Do not capitalize names of scientific laws, theories, models, statistical procedures, etc. Many models, and I'm not sure what all of your programs are in, but models that you're referring to either mathematically or scientifically, you would capitalize proper names. So usually the name of a scientist who invented something, you would capitalize it. That's part of the model. But just don't accept that all models are capitalized. A good rule of thumb is to check the internet and see how many sources capitalize it and how many make it lowercase. If you see it's half and half, chances are you can just lowercase it in your paper. Okay, italics. So students like to use italics in different ways, and I promise you if you use them in just these ways, it won't distract your reader. So the first example would be for linguistics, or trying to point out the difference between two words. So the following chart explains the difference between effect and affect. I'm setting off the words in the sentence so we know these words are part of what we're focusing on. This one down below, if you're writing a paper that uses a foreign language term, you can always also do this. And this is the standard across the board, doesn't matter what citation style you're using. Guatemala's mano dura, and you can see in parentheses in English, there's a rough translation of what that means, firm hand approach, has led to an increase in gang activity. So it doesn't matter what language, with the exception of a few Latin terms, you'll want to put those terms in italics. Use italics for key terms, but the first time only in either the paper that you're writing or the chapter that you're writing in your thesis or capstone. So don't italicize it throughout the entire document. It loses its emphasis if you do that. But if you want to key the reader into something that's going to be important, you make that the mile marker for your reader. Now, there are basically 4 types of titles you will use italics for. Now, if you get the italics right, then basically everything else fits into quotation marks. So the first one is movie titles, documentaries. The second one would be a book. Doesn't matter if it's a children's book or it's an academic book. The third example is the name of a journal. The journal, not the article. The article would be in quotation marks, but the journal would be in italics. And then finally, in text, you would want to italicize the name of government documents. Most government documents are not in quotation marks. Even though they might be 5 pages, they really are kind of like a book. So we do have LibGuides on the library website, and it does show you some examples for the government reports and how to italicize those in text and in your citations. Use italics to indicate statistical symbols or variables. So you would do this throughout your paper. It would allow your variables to stand out. So if you are in a mathematics field, make sure to keep this in mind. It makes it so much easier for the reader. It sets it off throughout your whole paper or thesis. Do not use italics to emphasize a point. You want your own writing to do so. Now, I did have a student yesterday tell me that the Naval War College says you can bend this rule a little bit for special emphasis. Make sure to know your style guide. That's really important. But you don't want to abuse this. You want to actually try and make your own writing as clear as possible and not use a slight formatting change to do that. And like I said earlier, the only exception to italics for foreign phrases are those Latin expressions that we've adapted to the English language. For instance, ad hoc or IE, EG, those are abbreviations. You do not need to make it italics. Okay, yes?
What about for terms that have different meanings in different settings? For example, if I use the term, the acronym ATM to you, what would you think?
ATM?
Yes.
I'm actually thinking of a military term, and I'm thinking of a place where I get cash.
Exactly. In the IT world, it means something totally different. And a lot of the some of the research papers I've seen jump between the two because you're talking about applications in the military and the civilian world, or words that mean different things amongst the different services. So how do you account for that using capitalization or italics? Was that picked up from context clues?
Well, can we go into abbreviations? Because I'm going to touch on that right now.
Okay.
Because I think that's kind of what we're going to talk about, is how to make sure that's clear and how we spell it out. I'm going to move on to this because I'm going to tie this part into your question. Okay, so with abbreviations, the first time you talk about a term that you plan to abbreviate, now I would say you should stick to abbreviations that are accepted in your field. A lot of students don't like to write something like community policing, and they want to write CP. Now, if CP is appropriate in that field, then by all means, CP is great. But I wouldn't invent, abbreviations. I wouldn't invent acronyms just to make it easy in writing. There are other ways to do so. But for the first time that you have a term in your paper, so in your paper or in a thesis or capstone chapter, now I say in the chapter because your reader might sit the document down, come back at a later time, read chapters in isolation. So the first time in a chapter, spell them out again. Don't rely on your table of acronyms to tell the reader. So that's one part of it. Now you're talking about having problems with acronyms that mean 2 or 3 different things. Now I would say because of that ambiguity, you would not want to do this. You would not want to spell it out as a shortened form. You might want to do something like referred to hereafter as, and maybe shorten it. So could you tell me what the 2 examples are for ATM?
Like you say, automated telemachine or asynchronous transfer module is what we use in building a network. So
are both of those used in the paper?
Could be, because you could say that's how I'm getting that ATM information back to the bank.
Okay. So if you were writing a paper where you used both, I would not spell it out like this. I would say referred to hereafter as the module, or shorten it, or you choose to shorten one and not the other. You have a couple options there, but I joked yesterday because COB in the Navy has 3 different. COB for most people is close of business, but you have currently on board and chief on board when you're talking about naval vessels. So if you were to have all 3 and you abbreviated it, it would cause a lot of ambiguity in your paper. So I would bite the bullet and spell it out or create a shortened word form of that term. Does that answer your question? Did you have a question?
Yes. In some texts, they say, when an abbreviation appears, say, the Naval Postgraduate School from now on NPS. Is that valid to write that from now on I will refer to the Naval as an NPS, or if that's the correct way?
This is the easier way, and this is accepted here at the school and in most academic papers. When I said you could say referred hereafter as blah, 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 that would sound a little more formal if you wanted to do so. But that example that I just gave was for giving a shortened form that is in words, not in letters. So you can decide what to do. If you wanted to do that, that's great, but it's a standard here at the school to put it in parentheses. It's just something that, when I'm reading, I look for. And if I know I'm starting a paper and you write something out and I see letters and you haven't spelled it out in parentheses, I immediately wonder what it means. So stick with this, and most instructors here, most advisors here go by that. Did you have a question?
Yes, a quick question about using acronyms and then the capitalization, kind of putting that together. Obviously, close to business, you don't have to capitalize that COB acronyms. So for something like POTUS, President of the United States, not if you don't use his name afterwards, do you capitalize?
POTUS. That's one of my, I was going to be sarcastic, say favorites. Yeah, I would say it's better to say the president. You take up almost as much space to say POTUS as you'd say the president.
Right, but if you need to distinguish between the presidents you're talking about, at least the first time.
You say President Obama. I would say you weigh your options. Oftentimes, if someone abbreviates like US Gov or POTUS, I think what ends up happening is you make things so abstract that the reader loses track of what's concrete in your paper. So keep in mind that sometimes spelling things out throughout the paper is maybe the better choice. Okay, I'm going to ask everyone to save your questions. I will answer them later on. I don't want to hold us too far back. You know, abbreviations and parentheses are so exciting. Okay, so this leads me into abbreviating the United States. If you're referring to the United States as an entity, a thing, a noun, do not abbreviate it at all. If you're using it as an adjective, so say I'm talking about U.S. strategy, U.S. policy, you can do that. But be consistent, and the NPS style guide requires that you use periods, even though Chicago says that you do not have to with U.S. So keep that in mind, that the NPS style guide supersedes Chicago here at the school while you're writing papers. Okay, a couple more. Do not add additional spacing after periods for those that require them. And always consult your style guide. And like I said, the NPS style guide or the Navy style guide supersedes your regular academic style guides in some situations. Okay, parentheses. We've already talked about them a little bit, so I will go forward. We already talked about spelling things out. So use parentheses in these other ways, but let's try to stick only to these ways. I find it really problematic when students want to insert really important ideas in between parentheses. So you can use them for independent elements, such as references to a graph or a table. You can use them for in-text citation if you have either author date style in Chicago or APA. Try not to butt two parentheses up to each other. You'll want to combine everything that you need at the end in one set. So in this example, you would have the citation and then the reference to the figure. And then always place the period outside the closed parentheses for in-text citations. But it's just the opposite of that when you're citing a block quote.
In that first one, were there two separate ones, or it's the same reference?
So this sentence has this citation plus you want to refer to something else. Okay. So just keep it in the parentheses. Okay, we're going to move to punctuation as quickly as possible. Punctuation covers many more areas than this, but today I'll be covering apostrophes, em dashes, commas, colons and semicolons, and quotation marks. Apostrophes. Really, there are only two main purposes for apostrophes. So you can use an apostrophe to indicate possession, ownership. So the president's new policy enthused and displeased representatives in equal measures. I think that's a universal truth. And the other use is when you're omitting either letters or numbers. And here's an asterisk for you. I can't remember where I left my glasses. Okay, that might be fine and dandy when you're talking, writing in a narrative, but in academic writing, you want to omit the contractions. You want to spell it out completely. Okay? So please don't use apostrophes with dates where you have the year and apostrophe S. There's no ownership there. If you want to show that there's a series of years, so there's more than one, a simple S is fine. If you want to omit the first part of the date, like this first example, apostrophe 80s, that's fine. Don't use apostrophes to indicate plural nouns. So this is a very common problem. This applies to even acronyms and initialisms. So you see WMDs over here. You can simply use a lowercase s. Okay? And this is one of those that's kind of tricky. If you come across a family name that ends in an S, you simply add an ES to indicate the plural rather than adding an apostrophe. If you add an apostrophe, you change the meaning altogether. Em dashes. Most students refer to these as just dashes, but often there's a conflation between this type of dash and a hyphen or an end dash. You will notice that in your books you have more information about those other two, but here today I'm going to talk about em dashes and their role in punctuating a sentence. So there are basically two ways to use em dashes. You can use one by itself, or you can use them in pairs. The more academically accepted way is in a pair, but you don't want to overuse it because it will stand out. So here's one that might be acceptable, probably in the media. The bill will create thousands of new jobs, em dash, if it ever passes the Senate. The company instituted a new policy, em dash, it was widely unpopular, em dash, that required all employees to work holidays. So as you can see, it allows you to put an aside, an extra thought into the sentence and blend it very nicely. You know, a lot of students have problems doing this, and maybe they'll kind of space it incorrectly. We can always work with you at the Writing Center. It's a little bit tricky, and with em dashes, you can actually insert a whole thought in the middle, and you know, can kind of work out nicely. Okay, so you can also set an internal list into a sentence. In Don's resume, he listed strengths, leadership, cleanliness, organization, creativity that set him apart from his peers. Of course, you could do it the other way, create an independent clause and use a colon, and then list his strengths, but this has a nice kind of style to it. It's a little bit different. So always insert a dash between two words without any additional spacing. Okay, don't put spaces on either side. Use em dashes in pairs in the middle of a sentence. Pairs are really the more acceptable way to do them. If you have to use one, please don't overuse it. Use em dashes sparingly. Commas, my favorite. Well, you do not want to bust out the comma shaker. I either have students that use way too many commas, like they're pouring ketchup, on their food, or they don't use enough. So I'm about an economy of commas. We don't want to use too many. We don't want to use too few. They are there to help the reader. So use commas to separate each element in a list. This is one use. Use a serial, also known as an Oxford comma, when you're writing a list. This example here at the bottom shows the ambiguity that not using an Oxford comma can create. The Marine expressed gratitude to his parents, the president and his platoon leader. If you don't have that extra comma there, you might think his parents are the president and the platoon leader. Plenty of other funny examples of this online. Do not use commas to set off essential phrases. And now, essential phrases are those that are necessary for you to understand everything in the sentence. So this is a literary example, but this does apply to anything that you're writing about when you're talking about an article or a book. Walt Whitman's collection of poetry, Leaves of Grass, has become a standard in the classroom. You don't want to use commas because we're speaking specifically about this title. If we block it off, we don't know what it is. So it would also apply if you said so-and-so's article and you have the title. That's also essential to understanding everything in that sentence. Use commas to set off non-essential information. So here are two examples. The House and Senate, despite the impending hurricane, reconvened to pass the resolution. The second one is what we call an A positive. I'm renaming the subject of the sentence. Barack Obama, comma, the 44th President of the United States, comma, is nearing the end of his second term. The set of commas and the information inside them does not change the meaning of what's on either side. Use commas to set off introductory elements, including single words and phrases from the main clause. And this is the number one problem I see with students and commas, is that you write a sentence and you blend your introductory element into the sentence without a comma. And this makes it really hard for the reader because you don't know what the subject of the sentence is. that comma signals what we're talking about in the sentence. So if you're starting with a preposition like toward or since, you need to make sure you block that phrase off from the rest of the sentence. Also, with dates, you want to have, if you have the entire date, month, day, and year, you want to have commas on either side of the date. Doesn't matter if it appears close to the beginning of the sentence or in the middle. If you're missing any of those elements, you do not need commas. And then use commas in that same way if you're talking about cities and states or cities and countries. You'll want to block off the state or the country with a set of commas. Okay, without further ado, one last activity. We're not going to do groups, we're going to do individual work. I would like each of you to choose either a set of commas or a set of em dashes and create a sentence illustrating how they work in the sentence. And go. So here's the first sentence. The Naval Postgraduate School, NPS, so I like the spelling out of the acronym, is located in Monterey, California, USA. Okay, yeah, I guess you could consider this non-essential, and you are following the rule, so good job. Let's go on to this one here. I was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, a very lively city. What do you guys think? I like. And you will notice that we don't have an extra comma here because it wouldn't make sense if you have an em dash to also have a comma. We're already breaking from the structure of the sentence. You wouldn't want to have both. So I think that's acceptable. What do you guys think? It's nice. Okay, the Philadelphia Eagles, the premier team in the NFC East, are experiencing a slow start to their NFL season. What do you think?
It's true.
It's true.
NFL.
Oh, I'm not going to pick at like abbreviations. No, I think this is exceptional. This works. You could also use em dashes in this case. And what I wanted to point out is that you can't always use em dashes. Sometimes it's just, it just warrants commas instead. Okay, and then the last one, another sports example. The Washington Wizards, mistakenly referred to as the Bullets, brought renewed energy to DC area sports fans. What do you guys think about this one? I would also say you could use em dashes for this one. Now, what you want to pay attention to is that with em dashes, you could insert almost an entire sentence, but you couldn't do that with a set of commas. Does that make sense? Yeah. So this is correct. You could also use em dashes, but in certain circumstances, I don't have one up here that is like that, but in certain circumstances, you cannot use em dashes. Colons and semicolons. Now, I will point out here that if you're from another country or you grew up learning British English, you probably have learned other rules for colons and semicolons. But I'm trying to kind of condense all the rules we have for American English here that are also academic norms as you write. Oftentimes I see these two confused, but they are very distinct in their role as far as punctuation is concerned. So use a colon to draw a connection between the information in an independent clause and another clause or phrase. So here's one example. Ideally, U.S. airmen demonstrate 3 core values, colon, integrity, service, and excellence. Now, I'd like to point out that what comes before the colon is an independent clause. That means it's a complete sentence. It stands on its own. I often see people write sentences like this: U.S. airmen values include, colon. You don't have an independent clause before that colon, and you wouldn't need it at all. So here's another example. This is the same point I just made. The writing process includes brainstorming, outlining, drafting, proofreading, and revising. You do not need a colon whatsoever after the word includes. Includes is the verb, and if you put the colon there, you're separating the verb from the object of the sentence. So here's one thing you may not think about when you're using a colon. Always capitalize the first word after the colon when it is a proper noun. However, in Chicago, if it's not a proper noun, do not capitalize it. That would include a sentence that goes something like this. My research question is as follows, colon. In Chicago, you're required to write a lowercase letter for the next word. So just check your style guide, see what's acceptable with that. That may be something you don't pay attention to, but the style guides spell it out, explicitly. Use a semicolon to create a distinctive connection between 2 independent clauses. So a semicolon is kind of like a full stop, but just almost a full stop. You want to use a semicolon only if there's a real connection between the 2 clauses, not just like a slight connection. You definitely want to use it only in an instance like this. The furlough affected all government positions, semicolon. Even the Postal Service suspended services. You'll see that the second idea follows on very nicely to the first idea. Use a semicolon to separate elements of a series when the segments themselves can be independent clauses. Okay, so this is a good example. Remember this example as you're writing. The commission initiated an investigation because the accounting department's audit had a negative outcome, semicolon. Inventory showed inaccuracies, semicolon. Communication between departments crumbled, semicolon. And important documents went missing. So as you can see, we have a very long sentence, and we have different ideas that each could be a sentence in of themselves, and I can simply use a semicolon instead of a comma. In this way, it's kind of a super comma. If you chose to use a comma instead, that would be acceptable. But sometimes you need something that's more of like a mile marker to show the major ideas, and this is a good way to do it. Here's another way to use semicolons with lists. So if you're trying to separate items in a list that have internal commas, what better way to use a semicolon than as a super comma, right? Otherwise, you would have a sea of commas and it would be very confusing. So here's an example because I love Parks and Rec. I recommend it highly. It's a funny show. The committee included Leslie Knope, comma, Pawnee City Council member, semicolon, Ron Swanson, comma, Parks Department manager, semicolon, and Ben Wyatt, comma, Indiana State Auditor. So if you have list items and you may have non-essential phrases in them, you know, have other elements that you need to use commas for, use semicolons for the major, demarcation of those list items. Okay, the last section we're talking about today are quotation marks. Use double quotation marks to introduce a coined or invented expression. Now, don't overuse this. The next example is actually about not using quotation marks in a sarcastic or ironic way. So this would be maybe an internal use of a term. or the way an organization calls something. So the corporate office called the micromanaging behavior of the district managers, quote unquote, performance stifling. This would be acceptable. And it wouldn't make sense to put it in italics because it's not a key term. This would be the option to use. Use double quotation marks to enclose the title of an article, chapter in a book, or another short work, like a poem or something. But you guys aren't going to be writing about poems. So anything that didn't fall into the categories from the italics section would basically get quotation marks. Do not use double quotation marks to introduce slang. That's kind of a given. And you probably shouldn't be writing anything ironically or in slang in your academic papers. That is unless you're writing something in a narrative form, and then you could kind of break that rule. Use single quotation marks solely to indicate a quote within another quote. So this means if you're quoting someone who is already quoting someone else, this is the only time you use single quotation marks. This can be a little bit confusing. I have a couple examples here. As the president stated yesterday, shareholder confidence is down. That portion is in single quotes. But I believe we can turn things around, declared the confident VP. So I'm quoting someone who's referring to someone else's words. This is the only time you use singles. So if you're quoting something directly and there are no existing quotation marks in that, just use double quotation marks only. Use single quotation marks inside double quotation marks to indicate material that was originally cited in another source. This shows a parenthetical citation at the end. And like I said, there are only a couple writing styles that require parenthetical citation. If you're writing in Chicago, you would want to provide a footnote instead to say, this quote came from this person, and the original source was this person. However, the best practice is to hunt down that original source and quote it instead. Okay, this would be the last resort. All right, does anyone have any questions about the material today? Yes.
Just a quick question. In the semicolon example with the capitalization. I know before we were talking about if the name is associated with the position, you can use capital letters, but I guess it's only if you're called, like for park manager and all that stuff, you had all lowercase. Is that just because they're after their names, or so the Pawnee City Council member, although there's a name associated with it, you're not saying City Council member Leslie Nope?
Yeah, you're not attaching it as a name, like their formal title in front of their name.
Okay.
So that's something you could kind of choose to do or not do. But here, when it's afterwards, you're giving an A positive. I'm renaming the person afterwards. It doesn't feel like anything is proper except for Pawnee, as in the city. But if you said Leslie or Pawnee City Council member Leslie Nope, you might want to capitalize all of that. I just tend to think that a sea of capitalization is kind of distracting because you want the most important things, the people, the places to stand out, and they don't when you have everything capitalized. So, use your best judgment. In this case, I think because it's afterwards, I wouldn't capitalize it. All right, well, thank you.